Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Richard Cytowic, who is a professor of neurology at George Washington University Medical School, also teaches the famous practice of medicine class to all of their incoming medical students, and is primarily a researcher on synesthesia, and has written a number of books on that topic, including one that I read, I guess, maybe 20 years ago, which was called The Man Who Tasted Shapes.
Right.
I don't have that with me. It's in a box somewhere, but I remember reading it. And also, Wednesday is Indigo Blue. And for those people who are time constrained, they can just get a bit of a summary of the whole field of synesthesia research, which I guess you created with this little book from MIT Press. And the most recent book, which I think has not yet come out, is called Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, look, I think this new book is, it's part of a genre, which I like to think of as the mismatch genre, right? The mismatch between the environment in which we find ourselves, which has evolved at a very rapid clip, and our genetic inheritance, which has not evolved nearly as rapidly. So there's a whole bunch of other books about our Stone Age body, right? In the modern age, our Stone Age brain, our Stone Age mind, our Stone Age emotions, and so forth. And I think you're really trying to highlight one technology in particular, which is that of the smartphone. You talk about some others like TV and so forth, but really it's about the smartphone and the smart tablets and what they're doing to our brain, what they're doing to our attention, our memory, our thinking, our sleep, our mood, our concentration. And I think there's two main points. One is that it has a very serious negative impact in the moment that we're exposed to it. But also it has a very negative impact developmentally. And so while some of the negative consequences can be remediated by the removal of this stimulus, there are some impacts which are difficult to reverse, right? Particularly those things which impact us at the earliest stages of our mental and emotional development. So I guess where I would start is by asking you what's new in this book, because there's been so much written about it, and what can you bring to the table specifically around the neurology, about the structure of the brain, right? How our brain is wired, how the different cells connect, right? And the synapses and the connections and so forth.
Well, there's been an awful lot written about, digital distractions, but nobody has ever considered it from the brain's point of view. And most people don't think about their brain. I mean, I'm trained in neurology and as a neuropsychologist, so I'm always thinking about thinking. People don't think about how do I think? Why do I think the way that I do? It just never enters their mind. And the most important thing is to think in terms of an engineer who always thinks in terms of energy cost. What does this process, whether it's building a bridge or making a device or crossing synapses, what does it cost in terms of energy, either in a global sense or on a molecular sense of how many molecules of ATP are consumed? And so the energy question is really what captivated me first, because our brains today are no different from those of our distant ancestors. I mean, they have not evolved one iota, whereas technology has been advancing 10,000, a million times more than that. So I do think we've reached the point where we can't keep up. We're asking it to do what it simply can't do anymore. The brain has a fixed level of energy that it can use, and no amount of diet, exercise, supplements, or Sudoku puzzles can possibly increase that. So when you're asking it to multitask or to keep switching attention from one thing to another, you're asking it to do things that it was never designed to do and that it can't do very well, if at all. And so that's why people are burned out and fatigued. Um, so I think that's my unique take on this is looking at this issue from the point of the brain and from the issue of energy cost and availability.
Now, I mean, ex ante, there'd be no reason to think that all of these technological changes would put excessive demands on the brain. In fact, some people might argue that the ability to outsource a lot of our processing, right, the ability to outsource a lot of our memory, this should potentially mean a much lighter load on the brain, right?
Well,
You
that's
don't,
yeah,
you don't have to
that's the
remember,
argument.
you don't have to remember like street directions because you got,
Well, that's that's
Google
the
Maps.
argument that either we offload this stuff and make it much easier, or we become so forgetful. I mean, I have what I call calculator atrophy. I cannot add and subtract anymore because I'm so used to using a calculator. Don't ask me what 12 minus 7 is because I can't. My mind just won't go there. Um, so yeah, so these devices have negative effects in terms of making us more stupid. People talk about connecting the dots and critical thinking. Well, but yes, I can look anything up, but how do I know what to look up? If you don't have any kind of general education, you don't have any dots to connect. You don't have anything to harken back to say, oh, yes, this reminds me of something that I read about long ago or that I did. Da, da, da. Um, so I think on the whole, they're making us more stupid.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't that require less energy rather than more? I mean, maybe let's get into this idea of energy usage.
Yeah.
You point out that the brain is remarkably efficient, and I think it surprises most people how, on the one hand, how little energy it uses compared to, say, Big Blue, but how much energy it uses as a
Well,
percentage of overall, body consumption of energy.
it's actually an energy hog, so that the brain consumes 20% of our daily caloric intake while only accounting for 2% of the body's weight. So it is an energy hog. However, and here's the caveat, most of that goes towards maintaining the physical anatomical structure, mainly by pumping sodium and potassium ions across membranes. So there's very little left over for mental work. The cost of mental work is actually quite small, but we have a very slim margin with which to do that mental work. I have a TED Ed lesson called What Percentage of Your Brain Do You Use? And in that, I go into about the brain has a plan, an energy efficiency plan that's called sparse coding. So when people say, we only use 10% of your brain, so therefore the rest of it just sitting around like a spare tire. Well,
Excess capacity.
that's not true. No, it's not true. And so that we can only use so much at any given instant. And that's what sparse coding does, is that a small number of neurons can project to a broad field of other synapses. And so that at any given time, the brain can sustain between 1 and 16% of the synaptic load. So
But you
that,
also,
yeah. So that if
you also,
if we only use 10% of our brain, then evolution should have jettisoned the rest of it long ago as useless and superfluous, but it didn't. So it must be there doing something important. So what is it doing?
well, you also point out that if people are, say, studying for a test, they use, or say, playing a game of chess, they wind up using a whole lot more energy than they do at kind of base levels. And I know, when I'm really, really jamming, reading a book and so forth, I mean, I have to eat a lot in order to keep going. I mean, does that suggest that when we are at rest, we are not maximizing our brain power in some
When
way?
we're at rest, we're treating ourselves really well. The Dutch have a phrase called Nixon, which is doing nothing. So instead of scrolling on your phone or having earbuds in your ear, look out the window, take a walk outside, do nothing, look up at the sky, look at the trees. You are really giving yourself and your brain a rest. And you need silence and quiet in order to think. You don't need endless email blasts and text alerts and notifications and streaks. Um, that all that noise just interferes with your ability to think clearly.
I teach a course on behavioral economics, and
Uh,
we spend a lot of time talking about cognitive load, right? So, there's a finite capacity for both attention and computation and so forth. And so, I think your point is that we're using our maximum capacity, but it is effectively being used for things that are in the service of
of a third party.
exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, we have fixed attention, we have focused attention, and we have shifting attention. The shifting of attention from A to B to C to D and back again is the most energetically expensive thing that we can
Mhm.
do. William James, the great American psychologist, compared it to the flight and perching of a bird. So we flit from A to B to da da da
Mhm.
da 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 da, and that's very costly and it's tiring.
Well, we talk about this in operations, right? If you're a manufacturing plant and you are, making five different types of car, and you're switching from the SUV to the sedan after a batch size of one, you're probably going to have the plant idle most of the time, right? Or at least everybody's going to be
Right,
switching.
during the switchover, right.
Yeah, and so people seem to think that brain plasticity implies that multitasking is just a matter of practice, right?
Well,
Get good at it, and you can do it.
Clifford Nass at Stanford showed long ago that people cannot multitask. And even when he showed people how poorly they performed, they refused to believe it. They said, "Oh no, I'm good at this. I can do three, four, five things at once." And he showed them the evidence and they would not accept it. It's been shown over and over again that doing one thing at a time and finishing it is much more efficient and quicker than trying to do two or three or four things at once.
Well, my students certainly seem to think that they can multitask,
Yeah.
right? They do emails and watch videos and do all sorts of other things, text while they're in a lecture. But you cold call on them, and they have no idea what
They're like deer in the
you're
headlights. I don't know.
asking.
So, what do you think makes them think that they can do all this?
I think it's a form of overconfidence, right?
Yeah.
And
The
it could
idea,
also
the
be,
idea of brute force, that my willpower and brute force and a pot of coffee or a Red Bull will overcome this, and I can do it.
but it's also, I think that if you are engaging in a bunch of different tasks simultaneously, which are not terribly demanding, right? Then when some of those tasks are demanding, you fail to recognize the
Well, this is
increase.
the thing that look, all these screens are demanding that we make choices all the time, make decisions all the time. So if you're making all these little decisions, when you come up to a big one, you're like worn out. You can't do it because you've been enervated by all these little ankle biters.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I think that the phone is just a turbocharged version of what we see in the external environment. I mean, you talk about how difficult it is to go to an airport and not have screens blaring at you everywhere. I mean, you
Mm.
go to the dentist's office and they have ads. You go on the bus and they have ads, and they're not just simply billboards, but they're now animated
Yeah, there's
billboards.
no
Right? You go
escape.
to the gas station and they've got
There's
a
no
little
escape
thing.
from them. I mean, that
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to find a quiet space to sit or an airport lounge where you're not being bombarded constantly by things that are saying, look at me, watch this, pay attention. And it really takes a lot of willpower to not look. And I have a whole chapter called Forced Viewing. Uh, you walk down the street at night, and all these companies have what are called street furniture, which are these kiosks with a rotating series of ads, or you've got LED billboards that are 2 or 3 stories high. And there's no escape from them. And they're very, very bright as well. So the issue of how many lumens of photons are coming at you is another issue of, well, if I'm on the street at night in New York or any other kind of city, major city, how is all this bright light affecting my circadian rhythm? Am I going to be able to sleep? Is it ruining the architecture of my sleep? And I think the answer, and I go into this in great detail, I think the answer to that is yes, it does. I've spoken to the scientific directors of the JCDecaux and other of these advertising firms that put on these displays, and they're in agreement. Is that these very large, very bright displays that are unavoidable, that force you to look at them, have a detrimental effect.
Well, I mean, I think you said it. Silence is the new luxury, and because you have to pay for it, right? If you go to the airport
Exactly.
and you've got to pay extra. You got to belong to the
have an
club,
exclusive lounge. Exactly.
right? But I think that there are some people who actually prefer all of the stimulus, right?
Well,
So I mean,
that's because people are very uncomfortable being alone with their own thoughts. We all know people who say as soon as they come in the house, they have to turn the TV on for, quote, background noise. If you put them in silence, they become terrified. They do not want to be alone with their thoughts. And why that is such an uncomfortable situation, I really don't know. But for me, quiet is the antidote to everything. Is that I call it an essential nutrient. Is that we need it to give ourselves space to think. And part of it has to do, I think, with people feel that they don't like solitude. They think being alone is an odious, difficult state. But I say that solitude has, loneliness once, and so if you can distinguish between the two, I'm here sitting in a park with a tree and a green space, and I'm quite happy, eating my lunch here in solitude, then this is a positive experience for me. I'm giving myself a nourishing experience. But if I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm all alone, there's nobody to talk to, I don't know what to do, you're doing a number on yourself and freaking yourself out.
yeah, I mean, it seems like there is a difference between the sort of passive use of these products and the more active use. So, for instance, if you get onto Facebook Reels, one ends, another one starts, one ends, another one starts, one ends, another one starts, or if you're in Netflix and so forth.
Oh, I know. Next episode up in 5 seconds. Yeah. They really know how to hook us.
But what I observe is that people will actively switch from one to the next. So, for instance, if the Facebook Reels ends for some reason, then they'll just flip to Tinder and start playing with that, and then they'll flip over to YouTube, and then flip back to their email, and then flip back to text. In other words, they're actually
constant stimulation.
Yeah, but they're taking conscious action to, get back onto a different.
Because if the reels end, they're going to be sitting there with themselves, and that is very uncomfortable for many people. And so, of course, their anxiety prompts them to go on to, let me check Tinder, Grindr, this one, that one, Instagram, whatever. There's a real anxiety about being alone with your thoughts. Because most people don't think about their thoughts. They don't think about how they think or why they think the way that they do. I think they would be really helped if they did, but I'm in the minority here.
Well, I mean, does it make sense to talk about this as an addiction, to use the language of addiction?
Oh, sure. Yeah. This is a behavioral addiction. So just as we can have physical addictions to opioids and benzodiazepines and downers and this, that, and the other, and nicotine, um, we have behavioral addictions. So you're addicted to your screen. It's the positive intermittent reinforcement. It's the same as the slot machine kind of thing. You're addicted to shopping online. You're addicted to pornography. I mean, it goes on and on and on. There are all kinds of behavioral addictions. And the research shows that the, uh, the opioid and the dopamine involvement is just the same as in physical addictions. So, and you can make people want things that they really don't like, which is really peculiar, isn't it? But they'll still go after that, even though they really don't want it. So it's called liking while loathing, and I mean that just shows how irrational we are.
Well, some people talk about how the problem with spending so much time online is that it makes it difficult for you to deal with other people in the offline world.
You have no social relationships. You are so isolated that you don't know how to. I see it in my students. They don't know how to make small talk. If you come at them, they pull up their phone as if there's something important rather than talking to you or looking you in the eye. Yeah, it's a real problem. Is that because humans are. Aristotle said man is a political creature, meaning that he's not interested in matters of state, but that he lives in a polis, the city of other people, a community of other people. So we're naturally inclined to make social relationships. I mean, babies do it all the time. There's nothing more fascinating to a baby than another face. But we have supplanted all that with iPads and iPhones, and so yeah, young people, it's a real problem. They don't know how to socialize.
But why is that a problem? I mean, if we are going to be spending all of our time in this online world, why do we even need to have the capacity to perform outside of it? I mean, isn't it kind of like you learn to drive a car? When people learned to drive, they lost the ability to ride horses. But nobody missed that. I mean, wouldn't if we're doing most of our communication through text, let's say, then we certainly don't need to know how to write in cursive.
Oh, no, I disagree with that. No, the loss of cursive is extremely important. I have a whole chapter on handwriting and the brain. So yeah, okay, we don't ride horses anymore. We have cars and all that, and all that's become automatic. But you're saying, who needs people? Well, to quote the old song, people need people. What kind of life do you have if you have no connection with anybody? Who can you trust? Who can you rely on? Who do you turn to when life gets difficult? How do you build resilience when dealing with difficult situations? So, and I see it all the time in young people and my students, is that they do not know how to relate to other people. And so when you're trying to teach patient-centered medicine, this is really difficult because it gets in the way of empathy and empathizing, and being able to see somebody else's point of view is different from your own, and being able to set aside your own biases. We need people.
Well, you described that scene, the Uber driver who was in the autonomous vehicle, who was texting while she was supposed to be overseeing the Uber car.
Marie Martinez, yeah.
And you talk about someone who is texting while doctoring as well.
Yes.
And it seems like there are certain occupations that, like security guard, that we probably realistically just have to give up on, because I don't think there's any way to prevent the security guards texting while they're supposed to be keeping an eye on
with distractions for decades. So what is different about the distraction of an iPhone than the distractions that have happened for the past several decades. There is something very, very special about this device. And the example I gave is the woman that she was supposed to write a change in medication order for a young patient with cancer. And meanwhile, she was dealing with a text about a friend's birthday party, and she forgot or neglected to write in the order. And the kid was really, really harmed by that. So, what is about these devices? And one is that we treat them socially. I think this is what Clifford Ness started to show, is that we treat them like another relationship. And the movie Her showed this extremely well. And of course, the denouement is that when the protagonist says, "How many other people are you talking to?" "Oh, 237. You're not the only one that I'm carrying on this relationship with." And it's like, how mind crushing is that? Is that I've been duped into thinking that this thing that I have been anthropomorphizing cares about me, and it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I must give it my full attention. Oh, I got a text alert. The screen has flashed. I got a whoosh, a ding. I have to turn my attention to it. So, I say, put the phone face down. Even better, turn it off for an hour if you can. Why do you need to be available 24/7? Are you that important that you really need to be accessible constantly? Being inaccessible is so liberating. You couldn't believe how free it feels. Try it. Um, and again, there's a big fear of no, I can't do that. I have to be available. I have to be on. Um, so these devices have also inculcated in us this anxiety that I must be a slave to it. Otherwise, what's going to happen? Nobody can tell you, but they're just afraid. I can't let go.
Right. I think you referenced some studies that show that when the phone is within reach or within sight, even if it is turned over, it creates some kind of drain on
It
one's
acts like
attention.
secondhand smoke.
Yeah.
In that it's still a drain, and even trying not to look at it is a drain. So you're better to just put it out of mind, turn it off, put it in another room. I mean, don't use it for a bedroom clock. If you want to use it for an alarm, put it on the opposite side of the room. If you really need a clock, get one with red LED lights, not blue.
Yeah, I think the secondhand smoke analogy is a good one because, like in the classroom, I noticed that even if one student has their laptop down, if there's another student a few rows away that has their laptop up, they cannot help but have their attention be.
Bernard Judy first showed this. At first he was very laissez-faire about laptops, and then he noticed how much distraction was going on. And as long as someone was in the line of sight, it was like bringing a boom box to a private conversation. It's like too much. So he said, "Okay, lids down and all that." But even better than lids down is put them away. And now you have the trend in high school and junior high of making students put their phones in a pouch at the beginning of the day, so that they're able to really focus on learning. And this has shown a marked improvement in their ability to pay attention during class. I mean, places like the Waldorf schools, which eschew technology until their kids are teenagers. The hardest people to convince of not having kids have phones are the parents. The kids are quite happy; they're busy doing other things. But once you get into the groove of that, the parents and the kids are very, very happy with having this reduced technology. Because when you say, "Oh, you need to learn to code when you're 5 years old," well, by the time, because you'll need this skill in the workforce. Well, by the time they enter the workforce or college or whatever it is, that technology will have become obsolete. So they'll have to learn something new. So what's the point of saddling yourself with all this technology when in fact what you really want to be doing at a young age is encouraging social interactions.
Mhm.
This is one of the things that was really, really, oh, what's the word I want? One of the really big downsides about the pandemic. And I went, out in my back alley and I would talk to parents who were doing, Zoom school with her. And I said, I'm really worried about these kids who are, 5, 6, 8, 9 years old, is that they're not getting the experience of socializing with other kids. And this is a big deal at this point in their lives of learning how to play, take turns, compromise, make up rules, etc. These are all kinds of things that you learn on the playground. And when you don't learn them and you've been left in some kind of technological bubble, then you're really at a loss.
Mhm. Well, I mean, you also talk about how the brain is very plastic, right? And
Yes.
there's studies that show that if you put on a blindfold, it only takes a couple days before you will repurpose your visual cortex towards
Exactly. Yes,
other things.
you get synesthesia. All of a sudden, your visual cortex will respond to tastes and sounds and touches. And so, what that says is that these connections among the senses must have been there already, because 2 days is too short a time for new synapses to grow.
Mhm.
So the connections were there, but unused so long as vision was inputting a signal. So then when you remove the blindfold, only 12 hours later, the visual cortex reverts back to responding only to vision.
Right. So one would presume that a lot of the negative effects of exposure to this technology can be reversed if people go on a digital detox regime. Well, and I think you said somewhere that what makes humans unique is that we keep our plasticity throughout our entire life,
We
unlike some of the
do.
other animals.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I mean, the plasticity does decline. I mean, there are certain things that have to happen at a young age. And synesthesia, I think you said, if you don't have it fairly early in life, you're probably not going to get it, right? It's
Right. You can't learn it. You can't practice it. It's like having perfect pitch. Either you have it or you don't, and there's no way to practice to have it, etc. It runs strongly in families and all that. Yes, there are critical periods when certain things need to happen. So, like in developing binocular vision, for example, um, uh, Thorstein and Vibel, the Nobel Prize winner, showed that when you had a cat and you sewed one eye shut, that after a certain period, that animal would never develop binocular vision. And the same thing goes with humans too. So if you have amblyopia, a lazy eye, that we know now that you need to patch that eye to force the other one to come into accommodation with it.
right. So, what are some of the things that we think, I mean, will be irreversible with respect to how we're now raising our children? I mean, some of the statistics that you put in the book, I mean, I was kind of surprised because, even though I'm here in Silicon Valley, as you point out, a lot of our technologists are protecting their kids, right?
Exactly.
I know a
Nannies,
lot of people here
nannies
who
have
don't
to,
let their kids anywhere near these
exactly, and
devices.
nannies have got to sign contracts saying that they will not use their phones near their children, etc. And
Uh-huh.
all the high tech people are sending their kids to the Waldorf School of the Peninsula. So here they are, and I've had tech people who had a come to Jesus moment and said, "Oh my God, I had no idea I was causing such harm." I invented the guy who invented the like button. He's so full of remorse and saying, "I'm so sorry I did that." So, but there's no undoing it. You let the genie out of the bottle, and you can't put it back.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's two places where the problem can exist. One is where the parents and the caretakers, right, they're using these devices, right, which takes them away from their children. But also the children are using these devices. I mean, there's some of these products that I didn't realize, like the iPoddy, right? Where
Oh, the
you got the kid,
And
using the
the
iPod.
activity seat and the iPod holder above the bassinet, yeah,
Uh-huh.
and the iPod holder in the car seat. The iPad is the worst babysitter in the world. look at a baby when they get to be on the move and they start crawling. They put everything in their mouth. They're touching, they're feeling, they're having a visual apprenticeship with the world. And when you put this screen full of mediated images in front of them, that those characters, if they're Disneyfied or not, they don't engage with the child in the same way that a real human being does. They talk at a child. They don't talk with a child. Whereas an adult who's playing peekaboo and so big and other kinds of things like that, they're speaking to the child in normal adult language. And these kids are picking things up like a sponge, believe me. And that's what they need to have. They need to have that one-on-one interaction. There's a famous experiment by Helen Hayne, the gondola kitten, in which they take kitten litter mates and they suspend one in a gondola contraption that sees everything that the other littermate did. Well, that kitten never learns to operate in the real world. It is blind as it was at birth.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, there's an experiment with an American child who had a Chinese nanny. And so they filmed this interaction so that another person saw the nanny interacting with the thing. Now, the child who had the real nanny had a one-on-one. They did a lot of emotional reading. And the kid picked up a lot of Chinese, whereas the one who was just watching passively learned nothing. So there's your modern Helen Hayne experiment, is that this passive engagement is the kiss of death. It's not the way to go.
Mm-hmm. And there are some of these things like you talk about autism and
virtual
ADHD.
autism.
Right. So these are conditions which may be environmentally induced, right? And where the environment is the technology.
Well, that's been, the incidence of autism has increased exponentially since the 1960s and the introduction of and the saturation of television. But there is a phenomenon which I write about, called virtual autism. Now, unfortunately, as soon as people hear the word autism, they freak out and they say, "Oh, my child's autistic." I said, no, they are having heavy screen use is causing symptoms that are, get this, similar to developmental autism. So they don't look anybody in the eye. If you ask them a question or give them their name, you're lucky if you get a grunt for a response, and you can't get them to engage with you. And if you try to take the device away, you get a screaming tantrum about it. So, I mean, that sort of indicates a dose response of these devices and the level of autism. But when you do take the devices away and get them, in a normal kind of environment, it doesn't take long before these symptoms of virtual autism go away. There's an analogy here with Parkinson's disease. Now, it was mostly said that Muhammad Ali had Parkinson's disease, but he didn't. And I wrote about this, and I couldn't get anybody to pay attention. He had Parkinsonism. And so the shaking palsy described by James Parkinson in the 18th century is caused by a loss of neurons in a certain area of the brain. Whereas other things, such as manganese toxicity or encephalitis, an infection of the brain, as we saw in Awakenings by
Oliver Sacks.
They cause something that looks like Parkinson's disease, but it's Parkinsonism. So they're slow, they're frozen, their voice is very, very soft, they can barely speak, etc. So what Muhammad Ali had was pugilistic dementia. He was hit in the head so many times that he developed Parkinsonism. He did not have Parkinson's disease. And so the analogy here is with people who have developmental autism, which appears at an early age, versus the the similarly looking symptoms that are induced by heavy screen use.
Well, the analogy I think of is like type 1 and type 2 diabetes, right? Where, go back 100, 200 years ago, there was virtually no type 2 diabetes. It was all type
Exactly,
1.
right. So it's all due to metabolic syndrome and weight loss yeah,
Yeah. And now type 2 diabetes is
much more common than
way,
type
way
1.
more common. And
Yeah.
I think, 5% of GDP goes towards diabetes treatment, which is mostly, uh, environmentally induced and reversible for the most part. I mean,
Because of our diet, etc. Yes, exactly.
so why are we not concerned equally about this sort of type 2
Well,
autism, right, that people have, which is,
I think that's a good way to frame it. You know, people are so concerned about what they put in their bodies: non-GMO, vegan,
yeah.
no added, no sugar, no artificial colorings. But why aren't they as picky about what they ingest through their senses? I
Mhm.
mean, the mental garbage that we take in is certainly less harmful than the occasional cheeseburger and Twinkie. So people just don't think in terms of ways that what is my sensory diet? Um, and again, I'm so unusual because I'm thinking neurologically, neuropsychologically, and most people never have the opportunity or the inclination to think about the way that they think, this metacognition kind of thing. Um, and so,
Well,
I hopefully I'm providing people with a very new way to look at this, a new angle, that's saying, hey, look at what you're doing to yourself. Look at what we're doing to ourselves. And there is a remedy for it.
mhm.
Because everybody agrees that our attention spans have gone to hell. Everybody says, I'm addicted to my phone, and yet they can't stop. They can't put it down. They won't turn it off. Um, and nobody's going to do it for them, unless the principal forces them to put it in a pouch. You have to do it. You have to do it for yourself.
Well, I mean, there does seem to be some pushback, where people are, um, getting rid of their phones by their bed and, seeking out the forest and so forth. But I sometimes wonder how significant that is. It's kind of like the organic trend. I'm surrounded by all these people who are looking for organic food, but for every person who switches to organic, there's like a dozen people on the planet that are
Well,
that are
there's, I mean,
switching to processed, right?
yeah, all the evidence shows that people can't tell the difference between organic and non-organic.
Yeah.
So, organic is basically, in my view, like a religious cult. But people are convinced that it tastes better, it's healthier, it's better for you. But when you do a blind comparison, nobody can tell the difference. So you're just wasting your money at Whole Foods. But when you do a digital detox, the evidence is there that big changes will happen and do happen. So,
I think you also said that there's something about physical books, and now I actually have
oh,
some
yes.
ammo because I get all sorts of grief from all my friends and family about the books I have, and everyone's like, "Why don't you just go get a Kindle?" So,
Because the experience is different. Yeah,
right,
I forget what his name is. Sachs, Saxe. His
David
book is called,
Sachs.
the Revenge of the Analog.
Yeah,
And he talks about the people who talk about the finishability of reading a book, or the pleasure of drawing in a Moleskine notebook, or I mean, I keep a paper calendar. I'm so old fashioned. But yes, going back to analog, and to the what the Dutch call Nixon, doing the art of doing nothing, looking out the window, stopping for a moment, going outside to look at my garden, see how my flowers are doing. It only takes 5-10 minutes, but it really is it's like food for the soul. And I love to garden. There's something about digging in the dirt that's very, very spiritual. When my husband died, I used to take care of the inside of the house. He took care of the outside. So he died, and it's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? We've got 4 gardens on each side of the house. Oh yeah, yeah. And so I took it on. I thought, okay, fine, let's give it a go. And I found out how much I really enjoyed it. And so that's a great break from this. The others, a lot of people then decide they can't take it anymore, and so they decide to try yoga, which is great. Doesn't matter what kind of yoga you do, just do it. Or the other is meditation.
Mhm.
And one of the secrets of meditation is people decide that I want to learn what my mind is like. I want to experience my mind. Well, the first thing they learn is that the mind is an unbelievable torrent of thoughts and judgments and opinions, and it just doesn't stop. And so the first thing you have to learn to do is to just stop that torrent, or just sit there and let it happen without paying attention to it or chasing to it. I know this isn't. I do a kind of meditation called Soto Zen, which means serene reflection. And so basically, you look eyes open at the floor of the wall, and you try neither to think nor to not think, because just sitting is the essence of serene reflection. But I confess that I cheat, and I have a little notepad pen next to me, because invariably I'm sitting there with my mind trying to empty out, and this most unbelievable thought will come to me that I would never have thought otherwise. And I thought, I gotta make a little note about this, or maybe I haven't tried it yet. Maybe I could just make a voice memo about it. And
Mhm.
I know that's cheating. The Buddha would never forgive me, but turning off and for a few moments is an incredible antidote to all this flitting that we do day to day, hour to hour.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is, as someone who teaches in the business school, that it's a lot harder to make money from things which engage reflection and
Mm.
problem solving and quieting of the mind than it is to make money from the other sorts of products. And so it's gonna be an unfair fight, I think.
And you notice how when people say that they talk about all the time they spend online, at the time they waste and all that, what's the solution? It's some other technological app that keeps track of
Right.
how much time you're wasting. I mean, that's no solution at all. I mean, it's asking the industry to solve the problem that it caused in the first place.
Mhm.
When what we
But
need to do is learn to say no.
but I did want to ask you about the things that are irreversible. I mean, you talked about how these brain scans will reveal there's less white matter in the
Yeah,
brains of
right. The
people. And
tractography and the diffusion denser imaging scans.
now, are some of these things irreversible? I mean, with respect to, you mentioned that um, the body is wired differently as a result of actions like swiping, right? So
Oh,
you're
right. Yeah, the swiping, Arcogosh showed that swiping remaps the hand area representation in the sensory cortex of the brain. Now, the problem with that is that, and people swipe in their sleep, they
mhm,
don't realize they do. And I think that's a fascinating finding on his part. But, unlike knitting needles that we only use to knit, or a guitar or a violin that we only use to make music with, we use the phone in so many different contexts for so many different things that it's hard to pin down exactly what we're doing at any given moment. So these qualifications of I spent so much time online, the answer is yes, but doing what? Were you reading a novel? Were you reading the news? Were you reading the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times? Were you looking at TikTok? You know, this is what makes field work so impossibly hard, um, in this field. And so we come back to the precautionary principle. Um, we can't prove that it's causing harm because the data field is just simply too messy. There's too many variables. But if it might be causing harm, then the precautionary principle says knock it off.
mhm. Well, I want to turn to synesthesia. I found your work on synesthesia fascinating, and I think
Thank you.
one of the things that you are, I think, implying in your work is that we're all synesthetic to some degree. It's
Yes.
not an on-off thing. It's there's a spectrum, and we tend to have our subjective experiences in one sensory domain influenced by the experience in another domain. I mean, my favorite study, I teach a course on the wine industry, so I always love to
Oh,
talk
wow.
about how if you put some red food dye in a white wine, it tastes differently, right?
And it smells. These people say it smells different. It smells like red
Yeah.
wine. Yeah. So the visual stimulus is affecting their olfactory and intellectual judgment about it. Yeah, that's great.
And so, I mean, is our use of metaphor in a way
Well,
somewhere on that
when I
spectrum?
say we're all synesthetic, I'm really referring to metaphor. So actually, synesthesia is an all or nothing thing. You either have it or you don't. It's not a graduated experience. So having said that, however, some people have more synesthesia than others. If you've got one kind, like colored hearing or colored graphemes, you've got a 50% chance of having a second, a third, or
Hmm.
fourth kind of synesthesia. But we have this gene that 4% of the population have. 1 in 23 people have the genes for synesthesia. It's not expressed with 100% validity. So a smaller number of 1 in 90 people have some kind of overt synesthesia. But the question is, what are the people who carry this gene who aren't overtly synesthetic? What are they like? And if it's expressed in a sensory area, you've got synesthesia. If it's expressed in the hippocampus and the frontal lobe executive areas or in the cerebellum, what kind of person do you end up with? Do you have a genius? Do you have a madman? And people like Ramachandran in San Diego and we think that this is a gene for metaphor. And
Hmm.
what is metaphor? Metaphor is seeing the similar in the dissimilar.
Mhm.
So when some woman says, I know it's two because it's white, there's something between two-ness and whiteness that is somehow similar. And so we think that these synesthesia genes are genes for increased connectivity in the brain, for metaphor that as a whole make us smarter as a species as a whole. Um,
Yeah, so they sort of have a bigger umwelt, right?
they do,
It's
right.
extra.
Synesthetes synesthetes are more creative than otherwise would be for their peer groups. So they speak a foreign language, they play a musical instrument, they're a sculptor, they're a painter, they do something creative. So there is this idea that these genes for a very pretty but otherwise seemingly useless trait um, is expressed more broadly in the human population. Now, when you ask synesthetes, well, what good does it do? They all say, well, it helps to remember. And when
Hmm.
you test their memories, they're off the scale. And some of them are what are called eidetic or photographic in popular terms.
But
So,
they also presumably can sort of spot patterns in a richer way. I love
oh,
the example
you're
of
much
the
faster. You're much faster. So
yeah.
if I show you a matrix of twos in which I've hidden a geometric figure made out of fives, it'll take you and I a while to search and find it. But synesthetes who see twos is different than five say, oh, it's a triangle, it's a
Mhm.
square, it's a this or that. So yes.
Right. Now, what I found fascinating is that the relationships between, say, graphemes and colors and so forth, that these are not arbitrary, that there are some
Oh,
underlying
there's patterns.
patterns.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of them seem to be consistent across cultures, but many of them are very cultural, right? I think it was like bridge and sausage, right? Have a particular uh, correlate. And then the other example of the Fisher Price um,
Toys.
uh,
Yeah. There
letters and numbers, which we all, people of our age, I think we all remember these things as
Yeah,
kids, right?
there's a subset of synesthetes whose colors are identical to the Fisher Price refrigerator magnets, and so people say, "Well, there, it's just that's the reason." But no, in showing that you can imprint on this toy, which I think the manufacturer of it stopped sometime in the '60s. The fact that you can imprint doesn't mean that that's explanation for everybody else, because there are many, many more people who saw that and didn't imprint. So that's just I think that's just an inherent fascinating thing, is that imprinting is possible. And yeah, what else do you want to know about synesthesia?
Right. So, for instance, if a word begins with a particular letter, it's more likely to have a particular
Oh, for
color.
example, yeah, when you for the what is it called, the Berlin K of how cultures learn colors, for example. Well, they all start off with black and white, light and dark, and then the first term to be introduced is red, and then we go on down from there. And so when you ask people, well, what color is A? So synesthetes say, oh, it's red. And non-synesthetes say, oh, I guess that would be red too. So there are some similarities across non-synesthetes that are also reflected in synesthetes.
They're non-random.
So it's non-random, and that in itself is really fascinating. I think for me, what would be the most interesting thing, and again, this is going to take forever to do, is, we now know from like the Gazelle Institute of, how kids acquire developmental milestones. So at this age, they learn to speak, have a couple of words and sentences, be able to tell time, be able to name their colors, learn the alphabet, etc. Blah blah blah. So, are we able then to look at children of synesthetes who might be synesthetic themselves and say, at what age is a particular kind of synesthete, let's say it's grapheme or phoneme, or colored music, can we map that developmental sequence onto the standard sequence that we already know? I think that would be interesting to be able to figure out, but we can't. And my colleague, my co-author David Eagleman, it's so funny. I tease him all the time. When he got interested in this, he was interested in tracking down the gene markers for this, and he figured, oh, it'll take about a year. That was about 10 years ago, and everybody's still at it. They have found a number of gene markers, but there's still a long way to go.
Well, while some of it might be genetic, I think you said somewhere in one of your books that we suspect that when babies are born and they're in that William James,
The blooming confusion.
Yeah, that they are fundamentally synesthetic because they haven't quite sorted out which senses.
This is the point that Daphne Maurer of McMaster University makes. She says that between 1 and 3 months of age, all babies are synesthetic, and she and her graduate students developed a number of really ingenious tests to sort of lend credence to that. But then after about 3 months of age, that disappears. I mean, some people may continue to be synesthetic, but in the overwhelming majority of infants, that cross-modal connection disappears. Yet, to go back to something that you said, it still exists in all of us, except we never think of it. For example, sight and sound are so tightly combined that that even bad ventriloquists make us think that the dummy is talking. And even when we go to the cinema, we think that the dialogue is coming from the mouths on the screen, not the speakers behind us. Dance is another thing where the rhythm of the music makes the body fall in rhythm to it as well. And that's inherently synesthetic, but we think, well, that's normal. Well, but okay, so is synesthesia, but it's normal for 4% of the population in a very, very sensuous, intense, overt way. Whereas in you and me, we only get hints of it in terms of metaphor and metonymies.
Well, last question. You've been teaching this course on the practice of medicine for a long time.
19 years.
There's a lot of people who are worried about the practice of medicine, and that the humanistic aspects of medicine are disappearing, right? It used to be seen as something that was deeply humane, and it is now something which is deeply scientific. I mean, those things are obviously not in contradiction with one another, but that the average time that a doctor spends with a patient now is about 7 minutes, and I think the bulk of that 7 minutes is spent
typing at a
entering.
computer.
Yeah,
Right, entering things that a government entity is told it to be. So basically, doctors are indentured servants of the of a government entity.
so do doctors see themselves as engaged in a human activity anymore?
Well, I can only speak for the ones I see as my own doctors and the ones that I teach, the young ones that I teach, the up and coming ones. Um, they try to be. They're realizing that the demands on their time are simply unbelievable, and so they're asked to do more and more with less and less time. I've got two friends. They're both doctors, and she's an internist, and she says, I don't care. I love to spend half an hour with my patients, and I can do so because my husband is an anesthesiologist and he makes all this money, and so I don't have to worry about it.
Mhm.
But she's in a really privileged position. But yes, it is possible to have a patient-centered humanistic approach to medicine, while being, what geistesgegenwärtig, attuned enough to the all the scientific aspects of it.
Well, does that
So
mean
I,
that
so I
we?
think it is possible, and this is what we aim to teach
Mhm.
our up and coming doctors. And
Well,
it's something that I never had when I was in medical school in the 70s. We never had standardized patients. I don't know if we talked about this, is that in addition to learning how to take a history and watching their wheels turning, we then have what are called standardized patients who are actors who are trained in a script. And they're given a really big backstory and they have training sessions and all this. And the students think, oh no, it's going to be fake. Well, they could come in for a common cold, and all of a sudden, boom, they are so emotionally drawn into this encounter with the patient. And we have some really rough scenarios, like breaking bad news. Your cancer has come back, you're going to die. Today's session was domestic violence, which is like really rough to talk about. Uh, but most people think I don't want to open that can of worms, but they have to learn how to open that can of worms because domestic abuse is so common and nobody wants to talk about it. So it's just like when we say, "Are there weapons in the house? Do you have guns there?" These are now standard questions that we ask people because nobody else is asking.
Well, does this mean that the engineers of the medical workflow have to take seriously sort of attention science, right? How the brain works, understand the constraints that doctors are operating on under?
I don't know whether they'll pay attention or not. They're coming from their own point of view, and they're coming from a mechanistic and technological point of view. They're not thinking about the patient. They're not thinking about patient centered. The insurance companies are thinking about how can we deny these claims? How can we deny as many claims as possible? How difficult can we make it for people to get the care that they need? I mean, that's what we're facing.
But do hospital administrators understand that doctors have limited cognitive capacities and that
You're gonna have to talk to them. They're in just as much a bind as we are. They're facing external pressures of a different kind,
Mhm.
uh, and of course I mean, if you ask me to wave a magic wand, I do not know how it would solve the problem, other than to start with the fact that the incentives are all misaligned, and that started with Blue Cross Blue Shield back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, when medicine couldn't treat much of anything. The only thing it could do was operate on something. So that's where Blue Shield came in. Okay, you're going to operate on somebody, cut it out, do exploratory surgery. So the doctor was paid for, quote, doing something. And then along came Blue Cross, which was for office-based medicine, and it was all based on what you were doing, and that's how the CPT codes came into being. There was this booklet of all the codes of things that a doctor could do, and then now we have upcoding courses and like how can you reap the most money out of insurance companies by uploading your code, It's nuts.
Well, do you have classes for doctors on cognitive load management and attention management? We've begun to do this in business schools.
Not yet. Actually, I'm gonna talk to my chairman about this, my neurology chairman about this, as the book comes out. Is that it's time to like think about how do we prepare residents for the incredible demands that are being made on their attention.
Mm-hmm. Well, Richard, thanks so much for joining me. The new book is called Your Stone Age Brain in the Screen Age. Also, check out all these great books on synesthesia. Maybe start with this little baby
That's it.
one.
When people want more information, that's when I point them to the little compendium. It's very short. The MIT Press Essential Knowledge series are written by experts, and they really just sort of digest everything into something that's easily accessible.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.